Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I hope that you're having an incredible day and thank you so much for visiting. So in today's video, we're going to be discussing 5 common watercolor painting mistakes, and I'm going to be sharing my personal tips and tricks that I use in order to avoid them, fix them, or at least make them less noticeable. So by this point, most of you have probably already heard that watercolors are temperamental or unforgiving or even just more difficult to work with than other types of paint. But the fact of the matter is that over time and with practice, you'll be able to gain some tricks, some knowledge about how to fix or how to make errors less noticeable so that you don't end up with paintings that you're completely frustrated by and want to throw away. Okay, so before we get into the time-lapse and the specific tips and tricks that I'm going to be sharing with you today, I just want to take a very quick second to welcome all of you new people just finding my channel. I am so happy that you found me. Consider subscribing because every single Friday I share a new video sharing art tips, drawing and painting tutorials, and general encouragement for beginner and intermediate artists. Aside from this YouTube channel, I also have a blog in which I publish posts directly related to these videos, and I also share over there a whole bunch of art resources that are completely free, and I'm going to be leaving a link down below in the description box so you can go and check that out. Okay everyone, so give me a like if you're as excited as I am to continue developing your watercolor painting skills, and let's get into the time lapse. Okay everyone, so before I go ahead and start with mistake number 1 of this list, I just want to take a quick moment to mention that I did consciously decide to paint an animal for this video because for me, animals are probably one of the most challenging subjects, especially when it comes to painting animals using watercolors. And so I thought this would be a great opportunity for you to actually see me making the mistakes that I'm going to be mentioning in a bit, and also fixing them so that I'm able to push through and finish the painting. For me, it's important to challenge myself to push through a piece at least most of the time. And in this case, the finished piece wasn't perfect, but I would say that at the end, it has a lot more positives than negatives, and I was able to learn a lot from it. Before starting with the painting process for this cougar, what I did was create a freehand outline drawing in pencil. I then moved on to place a few lines and shapes of masking fluid that I wanted to make sure to keep protected and blocked out throughout the painting process, which in this case were the whiskers of the cougar and some light reflections in its eyes. I also made sure to select the exact paint colors that I would be using throughout this painting process and created my initial paint mixtures, making sure to test my paint colors on a scrap piece of watercolor paper, and this is something that you see me do constantly throughout the process. Once my masking fluid was completely dry, it was time to start the painting process. So let's go ahead and start with the first common watercolor painting mistake, which is to paint over an area that was to be left completely white. Now, as most of you probably already know, with watercolors you're supposed to protect your whites since the beginning. If you don't protect these white areas, you risk your painting being flat, and you're not taking advantage of watercolor's translucent and glowing properties. And I think it's important to realize that even though you can technically add the white until the end using gouache or an acrylic paint pen or another type of supply, the outcome is not going to be the same. So in order to avoid the situation in the first place, I really recommend doing what I did before starting with the painting process here and planning out your whites and either outlining these shapes using a pencil and working around these shapes super carefully. But if you have tiny spaces like the whiskers in this painting that I really want to keep protected, go ahead and use masking fluid. I have a complete video dedicated to the use of masking fluid with watercolors that I'm going to make sure to leave a link to down below in the description box. So make sure to go and check that out if you want to know more about how to use masking fluid and how to avoid masking fluid mistakes. However, even though we can prepare and take these precautions before starting, mistakes happen, and there are ways to at least make these mistakes less noticeable. So what I do when this happens is I use the lifting method. And to do lifting, what you're going to do is you're going to completely clean your brush and remove the excess water from it. You can lift watercolor paint when it's still wet, and you can also reactivate it once it's already dry to lift up some of the color. It's important to take into account that some pigments are going to be more permanent and staining than others, but generally speaking, you can lift up at least some of the saturation in that color. To do this, either lift up some of the paint while it's still wet with your clean brush, or if your paint is already dry, go back and do some gentle scrubbing with a clean, slightly dampened brush. Scrub a little bit very gently and dab it with your paper towel. This will lift some of the color up. Moving on to common watercolor painting mistake number 2, which is to lay down a very heavily pigmented dark mixture on our paper right off the bat, or when we create very dark, flat, stark looking shapes or lines. This is something that happened to me at least twice throughout this painting process, and I find it can be easily avoided if you try not to rush. Make sure to start light and always test out your colors before applying them. This is a point at which your scrap piece of watercolor paper comes in super handy. But if it still happens to you every now and then, as it does to me, then don't worry, there are ways to fix it and work around it and make this at least less noticeable. 2 ways to do this are to use a lifting method that I had previously described in the first mistake. And a second technique that I find super helpful when this happens to me is spreading. So basically with this technique, what you're doing is you are trying to spread that heavily concentrated pigment that you have in that specific area into the areas around it. Now, of course, you have to be careful when you're doing spreading because you don't want that pigment to get into areas that you want to be left white. And you also don't want to spread that pigment into areas of different colors that may be affected. So you're going to have to use your critical thinking and sort of think for yourself if whether lifting, spreading, or doing a little bit of both would work in this specific situation at hand. But remember that when you're trying to do either of these, it's very important to clean your paintbrush and dampen it. So don't use it with a ton of water in the bristles. Make sure that it's slightly damp. And also be very, very gentle when you're going back and scrubbing your paper. Remember that you're not trying to completely erase your mistake because for the most part, it will not be able to be 100% erased. You're trying to make it less noticeable. So remove as much pigment as you can, and when you can't, simply try to make that stark, obvious looking, heavy shape or line. Try to dissipate it into some sort of gradient. And if you end up with a very overworked looking area, then the very best thing that you can do is just leave it and allow it to dry completely, because then you're going to risk damaging the paper. This happened to me in one of the years of this Cougar, and what I did was I just left it to dry completely. I skipped to other areas, worked on other areas, and then after a while I came back to the ear and played around with the values in that space, and that really made that overworked area look a lot less noticeable. Moving on to common watercolor painting mistake number 3, which is bleeding colors. Watercolors allow us to create these beautiful color mixing effects, And bleeding colors may be an effect that you're looking for in certain areas of your piece, but most of the time you're going to want some specific areas to be more defined. So in order to avoid unwanted effects, it's important that you take time to plan or think about what effects you want where before starting with your painting process. Bleeding colors happen when you add more paint onto a pre-wetted area or next to a pre-wetted area. Remember that with watercolors, when you place paint on a wet paper, it's going to expand. And this is going to lead to a blurred out effect, which is excellent for backgrounds or areas that you want less focus on. A lot of watercolor artists also start with an overall wet on wet layer all over their painting and then move forward, adding definition only to certain areas of their piece. It's going to be up to you what effects you want to create and decide on what techniques you want to use for your painting. But it's important that you have at least a general idea before starting with the painting process. To avoid bleeding colors, you're gonna want to take your painting process one step at a time. Think about what you're doing, don't rush, and allow layers to dry completely if you don't want those colors to bleed in together or to intermix. This particular problem, fortunately, didn't happen to me throughout this painting process, but I can tell you, for example, one of the areas that I definitely did not want this bleeding effect to take place was in the eyes. I knew that I wanted a certain amount of definition in the eyes of this cougar, and I wanted the viewer's attention at the end to go straight to his eyes. So I made sure to take these eyes one step at a time and allow each layer to dry completely before applying the next. Moving on with common watercolor painting mistake number 4, and this is creating muddy colors. This one did happen to me in this painting, and the reason why it happened is because I used a brown that I didn't test out in combination with my other colors before actually applying it. I think the very best thing that you can do in order to avoid muddy colors in your paintings is to actually first-handedly know what happens when you create different mixtures of colors. It's useful to know about the color wheel, to know about analogous and complementary colors, to start with a limited color palette, and also to not mix more than 3 different colors together unless you know what you're doing. Something I always do is before starting with my paintings, I always select the few colors that I'm going to be using for this piece, and I make sure to create different combinations of them in order to see if they work well together or not. For most of my color combinations in most of my paintings, I try to use analogous colors or colors that are next to each other in the color wheel. And this usually helps you avoid muddy colors. But when it comes to creating deeper, darker values and making browns or adding in ultramarine blues to colors that you already have, you're going to have to experiment and explore for yourself. Sometimes it's great to create your own browns, but there are so many different types of blues and so many different types of reds and so many different types of oranges, and I can go on, that it's very difficult for me to just tell you which exact colors go together and which don't. So in all honesty, the best thing you can do is select your colors and explore for yourself. Make sure that once they are combined, they go well together and you don't create mud. And the last watercolor painting mistake that I'm going to be talking about today is damaging our paper. So in the first 2 points of this list, we were talking about lifting and scrubbing our paper in order to lift some of the pigment. If we go overboard with these techniques, we're gonna end up damaging our paper. Personally, I do a lot of scrubbing in my own work. I love reactivating paint and adding more washes on top and creating different effects. This is going to vary from artist to artist, of course. But because I know that I love to do this technique so much, I can only work on paper that is thick. I like using paper that is 140 pounds or up. However, even with thick paper, sometimes when I am kind of very obsessive and I'm not taking a moment to step back from my work, I can overwork my paper and start to damage it. And the moment that I realize that I'm starting to damage my paper, I make sure to leave it and allow it to dry completely. So if this happens to you, just please let it go, leave your work to dry, and have faith that later on you'll be able to fix it. But make sure that you're stopping and you're not obsessively trying to correct mistakes, because sometimes you have to wait. Take breaks, be patient, and just jump to different areas of your painting and just realize that even though maybe at the end that tiny space isn't perfect, there are many things that you can learn and do right in your painting, and at the end, probably if you keep going, there's going to be more positive than negative there, and if anything, you'll have learned something from this piece that you'll take to your next piece and improve every time. To finish this up, I just want to remind you guys that with time and with practice, you'll be able to learn tricks that are going to help you fix your mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes, even professional artists, and you're not less of an artist for making them. I'm going to be leaving links to all of the different art supplies that I used to create this cougar painting down below in the description box in case you're interested in buying some art supplies for yourself. If you use my links, you'll be able to help me out a tiny bit so that I can keep creating these YouTube videos and blog posts for you, and this presents absolutely no extra cost to you over the already designated price. That's it for today, everyone. I hope that this video helped you in some way. I hope that it inspired you to keep going in your watercolor painting journey. I would love to hear from you in the comment section below. Let me know which of these 5 common watercolor painting mistakes you find yourself doing most. Okay everyone, so thank you so much for watching today. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and see you next Friday!